I am Filza as today's MC who will guide you throughout this event for today. Before we start, I would like to give a little bit of a explanation of what BOLD stands for. BOLD stands for Business Online Discussion, whereas today we will be hearing a direct presentation from experts about regulation and closed loop supply chain. Today's BOLD series theme is regulation and closed loop supply chain, which will be presented directly by Mr. Wee Myo, PhD, and will be moderated by Ms. Clara Intan, STMT, as Christopher Joshua Laksana, SMMM, as a lecturer of Business Management Department, Business Online. Before we start today's event, I would like to remind all of you, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any question related to our topic for today, you can ask directly through the chat column, or you may raise your hand during the Q&A session. You may also update this activity by posting on your social media, but don't forget to mention us at Business Online. Also, at the end of the session, the committee will share to you a link to fill in order to receive today's BOLD series certificate. And for now, I would like to read the regulation for today's webinar for the committee. Could you please share the regulation? Thank you. So these are the participant guidelines. For the first one, all participants must mute their microphones. Please turn on your video during session if you don't have any obstacles. And participants must change their display names into one of these. If you are a business student, you may change it into your student ID and then continue to your full name. For business lecturer, you may change it into your lecturer ID and then to your full name. And for alumni and public, you may change it to either alumni or public and then continue it to your full name. During Q&A session, type out your question in the chat column and raise your hand to ask permission to use your microphone. Please fill the exit ticket. The exit ticket will be closed at the end of the session, and the duration for this webinar is 80%. Before we start, I would like to provide some information for you, ladies and gentlemen, who are looking for books for lectures or looking for books for reference. Binus Publishing books are currently having a 25% promotion at Shopee, Binus Publishing, and at Tokopedia, Binus Publishing. If you have anything you would like to ask about Binus Publishing books, you may email publishing@binus.edu, or you could also chat on our Instagram at Binus Publishing. All right, so without much ado, I would like to invite our moderator for today to Mr. Christopher. The floor is yours. You may start the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Filza. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone is healthy and happy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and perhaps all of my students who join right now. Thank you for joining with us today. Welcome to International Experience BOLD Series Binus Online discussion on today's topic, Regulation and Closed Loop Supply Chain, with Professor Yo as Professor at Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow, Kingdom. It's Christopher Joshua Laksana, and I will be your moderator for today's sessions. And during the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. Today, March 22nd, 2024, is certainly very special because we can have an extraordinary opportunity to hear the views of an expert in this field. It is an honor for all of us because in this session, we will welcome our speaker, Dr. Wee Myo, as the Adam Smith Business School, United Kingdom, and well equipped to equip students with a comprehensive understanding in various areas of business and manufacturing technology. Extensive research experience in this field has resulted in numerous publications in prestigious journals, shaping the productions and operations management theory and practice, as well as market structure. As a leading researcher in the field of business, he also actively engages with industry professionals to stay ahead of emerging trends, ensuring that the students are prepared for success in the competitive world of business and management. Dr. Ryo has also received his education at the National University of Singapore, PhD, Integrative Science and Engineering, and Applied Mathematics, National University of Singapore. In today's seminar, we'll also discuss about logistics and supply chain concepts to understand how producers handle their responsibilities in collecting used goods. And we'll also explore some reverse logic and supply chain concepts to understand how manufacturers cope with their responsibility of collecting used items, and also perhaps analyzing the extent producers' responsibility, EPR, oriented regulation, and Minnesota Electronics Recycling Act, and Washington Electronic Recycling Law. Using an operation management for fee framework, Dr. Yo also will explain the benefits and potential drawbacks manufacturers face under these two regulations. And also, if time permits, perhaps Dr. Yo also highlighting some of the unintended consequences because of not using the supply chains concepts and when designing and enacting regulations for recycling. Okay, no need to wait long. Let's present our speakers. Hello, Professor Dr. Yo. How are you?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. No, good afternoon to
Good
all
afternoon
of
in
you
Jakarta,
in
Indonesia, and good
Indonesia.
morning in UK. Yeah, okay.
Yes, it's a
So,
very good morning over here.
without further ado, let's dive into our webinar and gain our valuable insight. Dr. Yo, please join me. The time is yours.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joshua. I hope everybody can hear me. If not, just let me know. So again, very good afternoon to everyone. So my name is Wee Meng, and you probably can tell from my accent is that I'm from Singapore, or related part of that part of the world in Southeast Asia. So I've been here in Glasgow for the past 6 years, mainly teaching in courses such as operations and supply chain management. And I also do a little bit of teaching in quantitative analysis for decision making as well. So it's great to be here, and thanks for the introduction. So I think today the title itself, right, does say something about supply chain. And again, I think we can't assume that everybody would have equal understanding of what supply chain actually means. But in a nutshell, right, supply chain is a network of entities, like companies or even organizations who are part of a network that actually creates a product and deliver to customers. So just imagine like Amazon, well, at least here in the UK, that we typically would order stuff online, where the products get fulfilled from a fulfillment center, but it definitely come from even, more upstream from suppliers and so on and so forth. So it's like a journey, and what really is important to us is the operational excellence in getting the products delivered to us. And if we don't like the product, then we just return back. So the idea of a closed loop supply chain is really closing the loop in the sense of the reverse flow of material, because in supply chain, there are a few flows that are very, very important. One of them is material flow, as we know it, which is why we get our products delivered to us. But there's also other flows like financial flow as well, because you need to pay money to the company, right? So typically, we like to think of closed loop supply chain as a way of, again, closing the loop for the purpose of, from a consumer's perspective, say, to return a product that it's not functional, all right, or we don't like it for whatever reasons that is. But in this lecture, I'd like to really make the connection between closed loop supply chain and also regulation. But over the course of the presentation, you will see some definitions that are interrelated to one another. But I'll just start off something really, well, at least.
Sorry, Dr. Yo.
Yeah, Mr. Yo. I think
Your
your microphone is muted.
Oh, so how have I been muted?
No, it's just 1 minute.
All right, all right. 1 minute is all right. All right. So maybe I'll just start off with this slide. It's a very familiar picture, left and right. When I was growing up as a kid in Singapore in the 80s and 90s, the notion of Garanguni, all right. As a kid, you're always very excited that the person is coming, and you'll always be ready to have your old collected newspaper, all right? Then you'll be able to get some in exchange for some money, so that you can buy like sweets, snacks down the mama shop, right? So as a kid, it's always very exciting because it's that heart-stopping moment of getting the financial reward as a result of collecting old newspaper. And I think at every stage of my life, you kind of learn this term in different ways. Like Garanguni was, the one that I always hear when they call out. And of course, there's also the rag and bone man. And now you have even more professional term like scrape dealers. So, I mean, the financial motivation is there as a kid. I wasn't so interested in the the reuse, or like the destiny of where this newspaper would be ending up, say, in landfill. But you're always very interested to make that transaction as a kid. So I mean, of what's happening. What's going on, right? So if you scale the Garanguni, like effort upwards, right? Well, at least in the UK, we have what we call the charity shop. What's that? I think a participant has.
Oh.
Was that a
Oh, it's
question?
just changing device. The
All
participant
right.
changing
Okay.
devices.
All right. Fantastic. Right. So let me just continue. So I was just mentioning that, if you scale up the Garanguni's effort, right, you can actually end up having like very substantial, like collection of old items for the purpose of reselling them, right? In the UK, we have what we call the charity shops, where again, I think the concept is very familiar in Singapore. They're known as thrift shops, but basically the idea is you can buy things perhaps at a lower price because they have been used before. They are pre-owned and pre-loved items. So there's definitely a market for this. So again, just to give you a sense of where we're going, from a supply chain perspective, there's this idea of reusing this product. All right, and I think we are very specific when it comes to making the distinction, all right, between recycling and reuse. So for instance, say if you if you have if you purchase something that comes in a box and you decided to you reuse them, we typically don't say it's recycling, because for manufacturers who are designing a closed-loop supply chain at scale, they typically will find it very useful to make the distinction between recycling and reuse. I'm going to explain why. But first of all, let us just think about the two very basic questions, all right? So why is there a market for secondhand shops? And where do you think the thrift shops would source their, items from, right? I mean, clothes is just one of them, and there are many other items as well.
I'm sorry, Dr. Yo. I think your presentation is not appearing on the screen yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just try again. Is that
It's already shown. Okay.
okay? Right. So can you see like this? So there was no slide at the beginning.
It was, yeah, there was no slide at the beginning, but we can see it now with the
Ah,
notes on, I think.
right. Okay. Can I share the screen for the presentation only, you know?
Okay.
Let me just see.
It's already appearing. Okay.
Okay, right. Excuse me. I guess it goes to show my experience in teaching online. I think we have moved on from online teaching since back 2 years ago when the world recovered from the pandemic. So we kind of stopped online teaching and has gone face to face for a while. But anyway, so let me just, rewind myself back for the sake of clarity. So I thought I'll start off with this idea of, when I was back in the 80s, growing up in the 80s, where we have this Garang man, which I think it's a very common phrase in Singapore and Malaysia, not sure in Indonesia. But over time, we kind of learned the formal terminology for this sector called the rack and bone or even scrape dealers. But generally, I think as a kid, I was saying just now that I was always very excited about, making that transaction so that you can buy sweets and snacks from the mama shop downstairs because, you are part of this effort in collecting old newspapers, clothes, and a variety of things in which this person will actually pay you to collect them, right? So that was the good old days. Definitely, this is a very sunsetting sector. It's coming down. It's not that, I guess, popular anymore. Assuming that some youngsters are taking this profession up just for the sake of making a survival through social medias and a lot of other ways of generating responses. So then if you scale up, the effort of Garanguni, collecting enough clothes, enough used items like tables, chairs, and so on, you can end up having, a shop such as what we call the charity shop here in the UK, and also the thrift stores in Singapore. So again, I just, want to give you a sense of recovering and collection of pre-loved item for the purpose of reusing is one way of closing the loop, all right, for profit reasons, because these shops are very, very profitable. So again, I mean, I'd like to start off by asking, like, why is there a market for secondhand shops? And then the next question is, where do you think the thrift shops would source their clothes from? I mean, clothes is just one of the items. It can be many others as well. So anyone from the floor would like to answer any one of these two questions or both questions, just send your response through the chat box. Anyone? Oops, I think I've gone past too quickly.
So anyone, if there's any answer or argument that you would like to bring up to Dr. Yo, you can answer it directly.
Yep, you can answer directly, or if you like, you might want to type in your response through the chat box. Why is there a market for secondhand shops? I'm not sure in Indonesia, but I suppose there are secondhand shops as well. I mean, it's yeah, it's very common everywhere around the world, yes. right? Because sometimes first-hand items are very expensive, exactly, right? Luxury item, I'm not sure, but if you are very fortunate, sometimes you do get great items in luxury shop. Okay. Right. So someone was saying that, well, there's Pasar that is five places to go thrift shop. Yeah. Great search of information, and then cost saving, fantastic. Thrift shop usually source their clothes from abroad or locally, I guess. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, manufacturing zones for clothings typically happen in Pakistan, India, and a lot of other places as well. I mean, Indonesia, I'm sure, manufacturing hub for many different things. Because of not everyone has a huge budget to buy things. Exactly. When I first when I first came to the UK, things are very, very expensive. So that was 2018, and buying like chairs and tables are like the most basic things that you have to get. And obviously, I mean, if you go to places like John Lewis, new chairs and tables can cost easily like £1,000. Uh, uh, yeah, and if you go to a thrift shop, with great quality items, they mostly cost a fraction of what John Lewis would sell for. So, but I need to I need to warn everyone that the gap has closed very, very recently. Like I would think a lot of students like to go to IKEA for buying the things, right? Furniture especially. These days in the UK, things are not as cheap as they used to be. If you go to what we call the charity shop, all right? So you have to be very, very careful, um, and be aware that, prices are not as cheap as they are these days. But again, there's always a market for secondhand shops. The one reason is not just the price, but also they are very convenient. In a sense, like I can just walk down, the most busy part of Glasgow, and you can see thrift shop everywhere. So they are easily reached. Whereas places like IKEA, right, they can be very, very far away. So they are strategically located around like very, very residential areas. All right, so that's kind of like the flavor, but I just want to start off some very formal descriptions about recovery options. All right. I just want to introduce like three very commonly approaches to recovery. The first is reuse, remanufacturing, and recycling. So the examples that I showed you earlier was based on reusing old items. Is basically, recovering products for the purpose of, well, reusing them. But like I said, sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion with the idea of recycling. All right, recycling and reusing for the manufacturers are very different thing. All right, I mean, this is the formal definition for recycling is the collection and disassembling of used products into their very individual constituent materials. So for manufacturers who are responsible for collection and perhaps trying to break things down into individual parts, right? It can be extremely different in terms of the operations required. I mean, it's not just a matter of collecting, brushing it, washing it, and then you can reuse again. No, recycling is really about disassembling. And one of the big differences is not just the cost, but also the energy involved. So remanufacturing, on the other hand, is kind of like somewhere in between. So if you think about the battery for your electric vehicle, it's a very high value product, but the high value product mostly situated in the minerals that is involved in producing the battery, like cobalt or lithium. Like some of these minerals are very scarce, so you have to, just like you have to disassemble them to some extent, right? But it's definitely more energy intensive than reusing, but less than recycling. So the figure below is an inverted triangle that shows you the customer, a manufacturer's or a governmental's preference when it comes to how do you deal with old items, right? So we thought that, oh, maybe if we just reuse them, that would be great. But there is an even better option of resource reduction, meaning to say that perhaps we can redesign our materials such that it is easy for breaking up into its individual constituents at a later stage. So resource reduction, all right, is one of the most preferred option because it's about planning for the future of how do you deal with recovered product. On the other hand, reusing, obviously, I mean, if everything has been designed, everything has been manufactured, then perhaps we could reuse them, as much as possible. And then it becomes remanufacturing, recycling, and slowly you're trying to, as much as possible, salvage, right? Salvage the product where for whatever reason. But you try to avoid landfill. Landfill is almost like the last option that you prefer, right? So this inverted pyramid is like a scheme in which whether is it a regulator or a manufacturer would actually be preferring how they actually be dealing with the collected item. But let us begin with design for the purpose of easy recovery. So in supply chain management, we talk about reverse logistics, we talk about closed loop supply chain. So what's the relationship between the two terminologies, right? So for instance, I mean, if you look at reverse logistics itself, I mean, as the term implies, reverse is opposite in flow, opposite in the sense of instead of going in the direction of customer, it's actually the customer providing perhaps the return, or me as a kid collecting, the old newspaper so that they can go back to the Garanguni person in a reverse way back to someone who actually values them. So reverse logistics, as the terminology implies, it's about a process of planning, implementing, and controlling the efficient and cost-effective flow of raw materials, in-process inventory, finished goods, and all the related information from the point of consumption, all right? It starts from the customer to the point of origin. For what? For the purpose of recapturing and creating value and proper disposal. I mean, for those of you who have taken a class in ops management, you might have some views about, how do we make sure that it's efficient? How do we make sure that it's effective? We know that these two terms are different, but as far as this definition goes back in 1999, I feel that, we could be a bit more precise. Say, for instance, efficient is really about, being, cost, right? Cost effective. But at the same time, being effective is really about how do you capture the value in a proper way so that everybody will be happy, including the government as well. So this leads us to the idea of the closed loop supply chain. I mean, I was just rushing through very fast about reverse logistics because a closed-loop supply chain is really an integration, all right? It's integration of forward and reverse logistics network. So you can imagine like the thrift shop, right? It's a very organized way of collecting your old item. Well, at least in the UK over here, we're talking about this kind of shops having the right resources, like the delivery person, no, like the collecting person with trucks, all right, with lorries, so that they can come to our home and do the collection. All you need to do is just to call them up. But on the other hand, a reverse logistics is a bit like the process of getting those items, all right? If you look at the closed-loop supply chain at a very macro level, all right, so it's the integration of the forward and the reverse logistics. So it's a much more macro picture of the reverse logistics because it's about integration. So because because we talk about supply chain, we want to have a good macro view, and one of those ways of understanding the macro picture of how materials flow in a reverse manner is as such, okay? So let's just look at the 4 different models. So I just want to start off with something perhaps maybe you might be familiar with. On the extreme right, model 3P, all right? So if you have something that you purchase from, let's say Amazon, right? You don't like it, you might want to return it. There's always someone who comes along and help you to make the collection and return it back to Amazon. And that's like a third-party model. And then if we move it back slightly to the left, model C, which is now the retailer is responsible for the collection of items. Say, if I don't like something from Marks and Spencer, the only way perhaps, I should say that there are some promotion schemes, all right, whereby if you return back some of your old product, then old clothes, then you can get a new clothes at a discount at Marks and Spencer. So there are promotion schemes like that. So that's model R. And then moving forward in the lecture, you're going to see model M and model C when it comes to the who is responsible, all right, for collection of the old item. So model B is basically about the manufacturer being responsible for collection of the old item. And then for model C, it is again, it's a manufacturer, but it's done at a more centralized manner. So, which is why it's called the central model C, C standing for centralized. So across these 4 different variations of coordination. So why we call coordination? Because in supply chain, we are very concerned about how things flow, and it requires the appropriate stakeholders to actually coordinate that flow. All right. Then the question is, how do you do so? All right. So these are the 4 different variations. So again, it's just a very generic question about, what inspires reverse logistics formation. Definitely is business opportunity. All right. These days we're talking about sustainability, but at the same time, we like to really emphasize on, yes, regulation for the purpose of, I guess, sustainability. And this is where the extended producer responsibility is actually a regulation. It's a type of regulation, all right? What it basically says is that, well, we think we should let the manufacturers who are responsible for manufacturing the product to be responsible for collecting their items, all right? I mean, collecting their own item is only one way of managing the product's end of life, all right? They might be involved in the remanufacturing or even in recycling, right? So the whole idea is really about shifting this responsibility upwards, right? Upstream. We use the term upstream just to identify, all right, which part of the supply chain the manufacturer will sit in. So it's basically trying to shift this responsibility towards the manufacturer or the producer and away, all right, from the government. Let's just let them bear the cost of, recycling, remanufacturing, or reusing, whatever it is. As you can imagine, this is an extremely expensive undertaking, all right? The collection, refurbishing, recycling, they come at a cost. So in response, I mean, the idea is here, the idea here is really to incentivize, all right? Perhaps it's too costly to recycle, perhaps it's too costly to refurbish and so on and so forth. But at least if we regulate, we hope that your behavior will change. We will start to look at designing your products for remanufacturability or even reusability. So it's premised on polluters pay principle because they are the one who are profit seeking, perhaps. All right. So they have to be responsible for the collection. So this is like the main description of the EPR. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the recycling act in the US. So I'm going to try and compare, like how regulation would modify the behavior to some extent. But I think the main message that I would like to carry over here is that regulation does require us to think very deeply about the scope of the products that regulators are interested for collection. Like who is responsible? How does that generate perhaps business opportunities for recycling to take place? And the very different types of act would provide very different types of responses, all right? If I think about the reverse logistics stakeholders, all right, I will actually think about, say, well, it starts from the consumers who must be willing to make the collection. And then you have those collectors, just like the Garanguni man, right? You have the collectors, and then you have the manufacturers, and then you have the government. So these are the 4 different stakeholders that are involved, not just in the Minnesota Electronics Recycling Act, but also other acts as well. But in the grand scheme of things, right, these are the 4 stakeholders that needs to come together and coordinate their effort in the recovery. So let's just begin from the Minnesota Electronics Recycling Act. Okay, all right. So this it's in the US in North Central, it's a part in North Central region. It is the 12th largest state, all right, as I can see here. And why the act comes along is because it is a very electronics manufacturing oriented economy relative to the rest of the US. So I believe there must be a lot of waste relating to electronic items. So which is why regulation is necessary. So a very brief introduction about what this act actually entails, all right, is something that was enacted in 2007. It's definitely more than a decade. It actually imposes a recycling target on manufacturers. Again, it's extremely expensive undertaking. So manufacturers are responsible for this target based on weight, all right, based on the sales that they make. It's like every manufacturers would be generating some sort of revenue from their customers, and you know, the market share is very crucial in determining what sort of recycling target that they have to meet, right? And the idea is, you know, we do not intervene on manufacturers' operational level decisions. Operational level decision means that we do not care how they set up their recycling infrastructure, right? We don't care how they make contract with the collectors, all right? We don't care about how prices for those scrape would cost to the manufacturers. We don't care. Let us, you know, just regulate them to be responsible for all these operational level decisions. And as a result of, you know, the government outsourcing and pushing all these decisions to the manufacturers, this act becomes a market-based EPR regulation. It becomes market-based because, I mean, they have the freedom to create their own recycling infrastructure. It might mean to some of us that, you know, perhaps there could be a business opportunity for me to set up a scrape collection company, a small business, so that I can start to work with these manufacturers since they have the obligation to do so. So why not let me, you know, start something so that I can actually make money out of it, right? So the government don't intervene in this respect. So I hope this is clear. And it's very crucial, all right, that we try to understand what are the types of product that the regulators are interested in, you know, in collecting. So for a fact, I mean, if you recall, it's called an Electronics Act, all right? So it must be related to electronics item, but they are very, very specific, but at the same time provide some flexibility as well, because the one category of item is what we call the video display devices, all right, like televisions, monitors for security with CCTV systems, computer monitors, tablet PCs, ebook readers, and TVs with CRT. For those of you who are, you know, born beyond the 90s, you might not have come across this too often or when you are very young, but CRT stands for cathode ray tube, right? So it's a very it's a TV which is of very outdated technology. So on the other hand, there's also this category of what we call the covered electronics devices, right? Where it comprises of computer peripherals, fax machines, DVD players. Again, I mean, these are just some of the examples, which I hope they could actually update because a lot of these are very old technologies. Let me see a pop-up in the chat. There's business potential for reverse logistics. I mean, in Indonesia, can we become the collector for the item that can be recycled and export them to the nation? Oh, yes, of course. I mean, there are exactly, I think, oh, that's a great response from, I guess, Marshall, right? Thank you for, you know, making this question. I think it's very relevant. Yes, I mean, if you are very aware or cognizant about what's happening around the world with regulation, especially I think in the Western country, and I must say that the US is actually well, not quite catching with Western European countries, because the EPR originates from the EU, all right? It originated from the European Union at a time when Germany was the first country to be regulating their manufacturers for collecting items like refrigerators, all right, white goods. So as a consumer, I don't even have to worry where that is going to go. But at least in Germany, nobody cares about that. But then if this regulation starts to become more pervasive and more common across the world, because now everybody's starting to wake up to the idea that perhaps maybe, we can get the manufacturers to start, doing good for the earth, then yes, that is a huge yeah. But of course there are regulations. Say for example in China, your idea might not work. Why? Because they are only the government is only interested in collecting items within their own national boundaries. So you need to be aware of how the extent of regulation, not just the scope of the type of product, but also the geographical coverage. All right. I hope this is clear. Yes, exactly. Because if it's as if we send a trash. You're right. So, which is why I emphasize on this slide that the product scope coverage, the awareness is very important, and also whether the regulation would dictate that it's just within our geographical boundaries. So you need to be aware of some of these operational oriented features of the regulation. Does that make sense? Okay, good. We move on. Okay, so then now let's talk about, the covered entities. I use entities in a very, very loose manner because, in many supply chain expert, right, they always like to use the word entity, but entity can mean organizations. It can mean people as well, But what is most important is we need to understand the stakeholders and their obligation. What that means is that at the very least, right, the EPR, as it stands for Extended Producer's Responsibility, it already says that the key stakeholder is the producer or the manufacturer. So that is a very important stakeholder. But there's also other stakeholders as well. I mean, in this in this closed loop supply chain. So again, oh yes, of course. Let us not forget the consumers. All right. So consumer is a very key entity or stakeholder, because then we can have the economy, we can have people buying the products, and this is how manufacturers can stay in business. So again, the legislation actually states that you must collect items only sold to the household, and it excludes all sales that are meant for the schools, the businesses, and non-profit charitable organizations. All right. So we need to be very careful and be aware that it only covers all those products to be recovered from household, not anywhere else. All right. So in some sense, you can say that it's actually very restrictive, all right, on where my sales. So now you can start to imagine the manufacturer's response. Oh, maybe if I have a very robust and a very good recycling infrastructure, then maybe I should only target the household, right? If I want to meet my target to the government on a regular basis, I don't want to, scratch my head and start to worry about how should I actually collect them. Then maybe I should tweak my sales and make I mean, obviously, it's only you're too focused on meeting the recycling target when the penalty is extremely high and a lot of other, factors as well. So in order to, there's another question that right. I read from Google, Singapore's leading vendor for commercial disposal is KGS Private Limited. And this company handles huge coverage. Oh, right. Okay. Right. Exactly. To be honest, I think a lot of all this is very opaque. All right. Unless we go and engage with the company itself. Because, I mean, the one thing about the regulatory landscape in Singapore is that I think the government tries very hard to be sustainable. I'm sure there's accountability when it comes to how companies like KGS Private Limited would operate. They must be meeting some kind of sustainability initiative mandated by the government. Honestly, I do not have the full picture of how this accountability process works in Singapore. But I think it's a very relevant and fair question to ask. All right. Obvious, and again, disposal is the business, right? And they must be embedding some kind of sustainability mindset. All right. This is an assumption. All right. But we need to find out more. Very good question, which I don't have an answer. Any other question before I move on? All right. So just to give you a sense of again the covered entities and the stakeholders on the process, right? So there's annual registration with the MPCA required, which you need to pay a fee based on previous year's sales. So the regulator states that the company has to pay a fee depending on what's their sales. So it might be the case where you sell way too much to the non-household, but you have to meet the household level target. All right. So there's also this what we call the statewide market share obligation, which is especially if you're manufacturing the video display devices, you have to collect and recycle to at least 80% of the total weight that you sell. So it gives you some sense of the quantity that you have to recover, not recover, but collect and recycle. And there's some discount, all right? If you're a manufacturer based in a very rural location, which means that operationally it might be more expensive for you, then £1 recycle is equivalent to 1.5 pounds. So there's kind of a bit of a discount for you. And again, I need to mention that including CDs, which are the peripherals fax machines, is very crucial because if you're too restrictive about the type of product, such as only the PDDs that you can collect, then it's going to be very, very difficult. So they included the CD just so that it makes it a little bit more flexible. And again, with any combination of product to meet the obligation. All right. So to some extent, there is some leeway by including another category of product. All right, so again, we like to touch on one of the key stakeholders challenges. Right. So I think the regulation is designed in a way that if you have any shortfall, right, the per pound penalty fee is supposed to be way more significant than the total cost of collection, transportation, and recycling all combined together in collecting the same pound. All right, so it's actually designed in a way to incentivize them or behave in more recycling term, right? And the one challenge that the manufacturers are facing is the fact that TVs with CRT, as I mentioned earlier, right, is a very old technology, and there's decreased in the availability of the product. So it makes it a lot more challenging if if the legislation doesn't cover a lot more variety of electronics products. Yeah. So again, another related type of challenge is they have to buy pounds of recycled CDs instead of VDDs from contracted entities, which makes up to be about 90%. So I mean, when it comes to buying, right, the prices are always very fluctuating. So you can imagine, like, it's going to be very difficult to predict and forecast the price in advance from those contracted entities. I'm talking about collectors, all right? So those who are responsible for collecting this item, just like the Garanguni man, right? So they are facing price fluctuation of those items because the government doesn't want to care, right? So let's say if the collection obligation changes from statewide, all right? Currently, the regulation is statewide. But if it changes to nationwide, then it's going to be very, very problematic. Why? Because if you decide that, all right, let's escape the legislation by selling outside of the Minnesota state, then my obligation is just considered like, within the state. So then I'm just responsible for all the sales within the state, right? But then it can be a lot more fair, right? Because if they are big manufacturers, if they are, making a lot of revenues out of it, then technically speaking, they should be responsible for nationwide sales as well. But my understanding is that this has not happened yet. But if it happens, then a manufacturer will have an incentive to design lighter products, all right, for the future. And I need to mention that because the manufacturer is responsible for everything, all right, for every recycling effort. This is what we call the Model M. And this can happen. And other models can happen as well because, again, now we start to think about, hey, the collectors can be our stakeholders as well, right? So some manufacturers might say, hey, I think we should be focus on what we do best. Let's outsource to somebody else, or let's go in partnership with retailers to do the collection. This is possible. This type of supply chain structures, a coordination scheme is possible as well. All right. But the collector have slightly different challenges and slightly different obligation when comparing with the manufacturers. At least the first thing is they don't need to register with the Pollution Control Agency. And it has a very, very low startup cost. All right. So there's no need for them to go through the same process as the manufacturers to do the registration. But because of the low startup cost, and competition becomes too intense, which means to say that there's a lot of people jumping into this game. And as a result, there's low margins and high revenue volatility moving forward. Because, it might be very profitable at the beginning, but then it gets a lot more complicated later on because people start to be aware of this business opportunity. And the thing is that, it's a very loosely clustered sort of network, if you like. If you look at collectors as a network on its own, right? There are very small, there are many, many small independent collectors, and they have a problem because they don't have that negotiation power. They can't do things at scale. So manufacturers might not be too interested in making businesses with them because, I mean, manufacturers, especially when they have a huge target to meet, huge one, of course, then they might want to work with much bigger collectors. So I think if you would like to start this business, think about how you're going to grow, and so that you can actually engage with the much bigger manufacturers. I think I can see that there's a chat. Right. Coincidentally, all right, I work in the field of bottled drinking water, and I sell a lot of it in the form of plastic bottles, which definitely contributes to a lot of plastic waste. Exactly, you're right. Currently, I'm implementing retailers who can collect used bottles and return them to the factory so incentive can be given to the retailers concerned. So you are implementing Model M from the lecture itself. And my question is, do other countries also do the same things in terms? Oh, yes, of course. Of course. Right, right. I don't have I think I might have a plastic example in China. They're doing exactly the same thing as you're doing. To what extent the incentive size looks like, I don't have the information, right? Because one of my PhD student is in the plastic business. His family is in the plastic business, manufacturing, exactly like I think what you're doing. But I'm not sure whether it's bottle related. Bottle could be one of those because it's a very common product. But I like to find out as well how big the incentive usually is given. Yeah, that's a very good question because again, you're working with retailers. Retailers can be of different sizes, right? Then I can imagine that the level of incentives can be different as well. But I like to find out this question from my own PhD student who is actually working on a recycling project. I think this is a very, very interesting question. So in short, the answer is yes in China. In fact, I'm sure many other countries are doing the same thing as well. Question again is how big the incentive is. We don't know. It must be from country to country. All right. That answers your question. Okay, so in a nutshell, let me just continue. That in a nutshell, the collectors' challenges slightly different from the manufacturers, all right? And the possible coordination scheme, such as the Model R and Model 3, they are possible, all right? Okay, so again, the recyclers challenge, all right? I would think that some manufacturers may not have their own recycling facilities, all right? I mean, some companies, they don't start out with the intention to recycle. They just want to produce some electronics product and make sales out of it. But obviously, I mean, with recycling trend kicking in, right, then some manufacturers might be interested in setting up their own recycling facilities. But at the time when this regulation was conceived, right, recycling was a good business opportunity as well, as good as being a collector, right? So again, just like the collectors, they are having very distinct challenges when compared to, the collectors or the manufacturers. These are the entities that's receiving and dismantling. They have a complete different role, right? But I think the common challenge with the collectors is that competition is very intense as well, right? And the Act do require them to specify the weight just for reconciliation purposes, right? That they have to specify exactly how much weight from the 11 counties that's dividing Minnesota, sorry, all the counties plus the greater Minnesota area that's dividing Minnesota, all right? So they need to be very transparent about the weight that they're collecting. And I'm sure to some extent the legislation do require them to specify and also to meet the target for certain counties. So they start to respond by creating all the different boundaries for recycling facilities. And like I say, one of the operations challenge for recycling is that there might be a low future supply of OCRT simply because the technology is old. And if you already own something huge, right, from a recycling capacity standpoint, then chances are those part of the facilities that recycle OCRT might not be relevant anymore in the future. So you need to be cognizant about how technology evolve at the same time, you know. And again, overall processing cost is too high, especially those containing hazardous materials, all right? So apart from just the product scope, you need to understand what are the actual constituents of the product. And then this is exactly why many registered recyclers export waste overseas to developing countries for more business opportunity purpose. All right, so this slide is actually just to convey, in my regular class, I actually try to explain why a recycling and this sort of business is no different from the regular type of manufacturing business where forecasting, where allocating resources and all these things are similar it is, but of different nature. It's just that we try to, explain why forecasting is still relevant in the context of recycling. For instance, I mean, if you want to be able to make the right decisions on how many pounds to purchase, because I might have a shortfall, then I might have to, forecast how much I can collect and to understand what is my recycling target obligation. So again, it's no different from supply chain, forward supply chain, where I need to negotiate and contract with, making contracts with recyclers as well. And then based on this forecast, I need to make further decisions about collection plan, as much as how we, make production scheduling plan in a lot of manufacturing companies, but in a different context, right? Like you got to determine the number and collections of the locations, sorry, of collection sites, right? Just like how you would decide on where you should locate the plant, how many plants should you have, right? But it's just in the context again in recycling. And then you need to keep track of your collection volume on a periodic basis, simply because at the end of the year, you are accountable for your target. And then you have to update, right? You have to update. In some cases, you can work with other manufacturers so that you can cross-purchase extra pounds just so that you can actually meet future obligations. All right, so this slide is just to communicate that forecasting, production scheduling sort of mindset is still relevant in a recycling context. All right, so I'm done pretty much talking about the Minnesota Recycling Act. But I'm going to just very quickly try to bring in another recycling law in a very summarized form so that we can have some very good takeaway from this. All right. I've divided the differences between these two laws according to the few characteristics. For example, the product scope, right? So we have talked about what type of product, and CD, such as a fax machine, add some kind of leeway or flexibility so that, manufacturers can combine weight in many different ways to meet the target. But when it comes to the Washington Electronics Recycling Law, it's slightly more rigid in the sense that there's no CD, all right? But the video display devices is slightly more accommodating in the sense that, all right, as long as it's more than 4 inches and above, you're allowed to collect that. But then you see that the Minnesota Recycling Act is slightly more restrictive on the video display size, right? Screen size, which must be equivalent to 9 inches and above. So to some extent, they have different form of flexibility when it comes to the product scope. Good. The next characteristic is the covered entities. Like I mentioned, the Minnesota Recycling Act only covers sales of products to household. It excludes everybody else. But for the Washington Recycling Act, it's slightly more encompassing, that includes all schools, businesses, non-profit, blah, blah, blah. So the covered entities is actually much broader from a consumer's perspective. And then the next thing is the coordination scheme variations, the variants of it, the types, the different types of it. And again, I took quite a long time to explain that all possible coordination structure is possible, right? The Model M, Model R, Model 3P is very possible for the Minnesota Recycling Act simply because the government just outsource and push all the responsibility out to the manufacturers. But the Washington Act is slightly more paternalistic in the sense that I'm going to control everything. It's more centralized and coordinated in my own terms. All right. And that's the regulation standpoint, the regulator standpoint. Next, it's about contracting partnership variation. Again, as a recall, manufacturer and recycler they must make contract with one another. It's possible to contract with retailer. It's possible to contract with third party. Market is free. Do whatever you want as long as you meet the target. All right. But on the other hand, for the Washington law, the government is controlling everything, right? So they appoint their own recyclers, not the manufacturer's own choosing, own choice. All right. So you can imagine like the recyclers must go through a lot more process to get approved in the Washington state. So if you're thinking about setting up your own recycling and collecting business, you have to understand, right, what you need to go through at every state. And then the next characteristic is about obligation. And I actually divided them into what is the recycling obligation and what is the reverse logistical obligation, right? Again, there are differences between the two acts. In terms of recycling, all right, the Minnesota Recycling Act requires all manufacturers to target at least 80% of previous year's sales. But then the Washington Act is saying, well, we have a standardized plan for everybody. All right, so you have to, you have to meet our standardized plan. And the last thing is the obligation in terms of logistical scale. For the Minnesota Act, again, you need to go through the different types of processes. You need certification. You need to specify exactly how many pounds it collected from which county, and so on and so forth, right? And then for the collectors, you need to declare sources, amounts, and who are the contracting recyclers. All right, so you need to be very, very, very transparent. Again, why the transparency is needed? Because the Minnesota Act pushes out everything to the manufacturer. So they are enacting something else just to ensure that, all right, at least we still have some kind of information flowing back to us in a very transparent manner. And this is how they do it. Certification, declaration, specification. All right. So then lastly, this is obviously completely opposite for the Washington law, which basically says that, well, the government are the ones who are responsible for setting up the collection sites, choosing the company, and determining the prices in a not so free sort of market environment. So then the question is, all right, I think we need to understand which act is maybe more effective. This is more for trying to help the government think about, is it a decentralized approach or a centralized approach is more effective? But before going into the operational sort of philosophical question, we might want to think about, what does it mean for regulation to be effective, right? I mean, in operations management, we always make the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness. But from a regulation standpoint, what is effectiveness? It actually means how encouraging you are when it comes to designing your products for recycling, how easy it is for breaking things up and make things easy for everybody. But I need to mention that, in certain times, there are IP involved. IP means intellectual properties involved, meaning to say that in my product, there are some secrets, industry secrets, right? Which I do not like to reveal because they are hidden in the technology. So if you actually do dismantle them, that's going to be a problem. All right. Products include like the printer cartridge, right? One is one of those with very high physical IP. And then the currently what we're seeing, what we're observing is that the current legislation actually favors reducing product weight than reducing toxicity. Because I mean, they are so concerned about weight. How much weight can you collect, right? They don't care about, say for example, how do you distinguish a product from one company to another company, and how easy is it to recycle this product? Because I mean, if you cannot break down further, then perhaps you cannot do good for sustainability, right? I think this is perhaps some kind of regulators' vision of what effective recycling actually means. And it turns out that there are researchers studying, the differences in terms of which one is more effective. And it turns out that the Minnesota is more effective than the Washington Act, simply because, in the Washington Act, there's loopholes for free riding to take place. Because if everybody is, if this is a very centralized collection system, it must be a coordinated, centralized target that everybody must meet together. Then as a manufacturer, I might actually push the responsibility to somebody else. I say, hey, I don't have much to collect. Maybe somebody will do the collection. So this is called free riding. And is what that explains the loss of efficiency for the Washington Act. Okay. Again, thanks for your comment that this is a very interesting topic. If I look at Indonesia, some products, such as electronic products, should be initiated to include writing on the boxes that this product can be recycled. I agree. I agree that, by providing additional information about recyclability to the manufacturer, it's actually a very, very good starting point, all right? But this does require the involvement of, right, exactly. So, which is why I think why EPR was started by a government, by the EU regulators, is because they are in power of making changes, all right? It must start from somewhere, and they are the ones who actually starts that. All right. So in summary, I just want to mention, I hope I've actually delivered the message that legislation, all right? If you think deeper, is about allocation of obligation, allocation of responsibility, to what extent that obligation must be written very clearly in the legislation. And for the stakeholders, they need to understand the roles, which includes what they need to do to meet the obligation for recycling target. And again, depending on how the legislation is framed, they may or may not induce market-based opportunities for emergence of independent entities such as collectors or recyclers, right? So if you try to if you try to export your waste to Washington, they probably might not accept it because, the government has already appointed those recyclers that they have in mind. And the last point I'd like to make is that it results in the various supply chain structures, like the four models that I've covered, which includes the Model C, Model 3P, Model R, Model M included. All right, so centralized, decentralized, they have different effects on efficiency. And again, there's some really very, very fundamental question. I'd like to quickly close my lecture. I hope I'm on time and I'm not exceeding. But just want to, think about whether on a smaller scale, is it an individual producer's responsibility or is it collective responsibility, right? This is one question. And the second question and the third question are invariably connected, all right? What I mean by that is that, first of all, if I think about, is it necessary to use legal instrument as the best approach to encourage or to mandate, I should say mandate as the word, for recycling? I'm just thinking about, because mandating can be part of enforcement, right? So then instead of enforcement, can we think about encouraging instead? So I like to bring back, I like to close the loop to the example about the Garanguni when I was a kid. I was so encouraged, not because of recycling, but because of, the transactions that I was able to enjoy, allowing me some to have some financial incentive to go down to the mama shop and buy some sweets and snack. So it kind of encouraged me to collect those old newspapers, cardboard, blah, 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 so that I can meet some sort of a sales target for myself. So I think of, critical mineral resilience as a topic, which basically says that, well, a lot of companies are heavily reliant on suppliers for very critical resources. For example, I mean, in the case of electric vehicle batteries, right? There are many precious minerals, and one of those is cobalt. And it is not a very good idea for, let's say, Tesla to be so dependent on, where this mineral sources is coming from, especially, I think, in Africa. I can't remember exactly. I think it's Congo, if I'm not wrong. So in order to reduce this reliance on critical minerals sources, one might think about remanufacturing or even recycling, breaking things up into constituent matter so that they can reuse some of those critical minerals. We're not sure whether this is possible, but at least from an encouraging standpoint, right? We can think about, yeah, I mean, not relying on the suppliers of cobalt in Africa, right? Especially, I think currently we are experiencing in a lot of fractures of frictions geopolitically. Since I've arrived here in the UK, the first thing that I experienced was the effects of Brexit, right? Brexit, one of those, the leaving of EU by the UK government. Things becomes very, very expensive. And then we suddenly realize that, hey, actually we rely on this European Union, being a part of European Union, to get our resources, such as researchers from the EU countries, all right, or even very affordable sources of renewable energy. Prices has gone up, not just on, renewable energy when Brexit actually materialized, but also the cost of hiring EU researchers, because now we need a separate contract for them, right? So there's a lot of geopolitical tensions. War especially, it has created a surge of prices for natural gases. So things are very, very expensive now. So you can imagine like how we can reposition recycling. If we're thinking about resilience, all right, if we're thinking about reducing our dependency of this sort of very precious metals from original sources, then recycling and remanufacturing can be a very, very good approach in that. All right, so that's all I have. I hope that's the key message that I'd like to deliver in closing this loop. Thank you very much for your attention. I think it's a very long lecture, and I hope you're still all right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Yo. Indeed, it's a very interesting presentation that been delivered, because there is a supply chain in a nutshell, where there is starts with the raw material, and then it moves through productions, and it also involves a transportation and reaches a inventory or warehouse, and that ends up being with the customers. Okay. I think there's already a students that would like to ask a questions to Dr. Yo. Mr.
Yes.
Didin Rosidin.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Yo.
Hi, Didin.
Yes. Yeah, my name's Didin. I'm from being a student. I have a question. Yeah.
Yes,
So
of course.
the main issue or the challenge in recycling is the cost.
Yes.
Yeah, is the cost, and this is a key factor, so we can avoid it. We can avoid this. So, what are the strategies for the company to minimize the cost? So when we recycle the goods, we spend less money, and we can sell it with a profit as well.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So I think your question is, how do we reduce the cost, right, in terms of
Cost, correct.
recycling, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, like I mentioned, if you recall the inverted triangle, one of the most preferred option was to design your products for recycling. I think if a manufacturer looks forward, a forward-looking, manufacturer will start to think about, hey, is my product design has been easy in terms of, breaking things up? Because as you mentioned, recycling is very expensive and we cannot avoid it. But at least we can change something in what we offer so that it make things easier for us in the future if we encounter such obligation to do so. Does that make sense?
Yes, but what about like transport and then workers?
Good question. Good question. Okay, one thing we have to acknowledge, even in the UK here, I've not seen for once prices has actually come down. Whether it is your gas, whether it is your utilities, but even for recycling, they must also cope with inflation. This is, it's almost like I can, on the one hand, be optimizing my transportation decisions, right? To counter something else, which is called the inflation. This is a monster that nobody can avoid. But if you can, you have to catch up, right? You have to catch up with inflation. But at the same time, I would say one solution, as you probably might think that is possible, is going to be optimization on a number of decisions that's involved in recycling. Transportation, as you say, is one of them. Collection, right? How do you engage with the collectors and what sort of prices are being commanded today? There might be a lot of supply, all right? So the one thing about reverse logistics or recycling is that the supply of those items are uncertain and they have impact on the price in which you can actually collect if you actually want to meet some kind of target and you need to buy them.
Yeah.
Right? Prices are coming up and down. So these are some of the things that manufacturers cannot control. So we need to understand what are the decisions that we can control and the ones that we cannot control. The ones that we can control means are those that we can actually do optimization about. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. One more question. Based on your experience, so when you were a kid in Singapore, yeah,
Mhm.
how do you see the Garanguni strategies, yeah, to minimize the costs?
I think it's a very interesting question. I should say I can only reflect because when I was a kid, right, I don't even think about what are their strategies. You know what I'm saying? But I think okay, my observation as a kid was that they come very often. They come too often. And then I don't have enough things to, sell to them. So that was one of my regret. Strategies, honestly, I never reflected about their strategies, but the fact that they are coming very often, different people coming in, um, sends me a message on reflection now that they are probably not very coordinated,
Mm.
They're not very coordinated. It's not like maybe I should, if you collect in the morning, I collect in the, whether there's this sort of conversation or partnership involved, just so that they can make it a lot more regulated and make them more predictable. But you can think about, back in those days, perhaps there's quite a lot of business, quite a lot of opportunities for them to collect the cardboards. Things are selling at a much higher prices. But these days, the way to do it is perhaps through social media. I don't know. I mean, we have, I mean, I can't speak for the Garanguni man, but I would think that the social media is one way of, doing things at scale and more effective as well. Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Yam.
No problem.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Didin Rosidin, for the questions. Are there any questions as well?
I think that was a very good question. I never think about Garanguni strategy.
Well, oh, there's another questions from Mr. Ahmad Ardi.
Yes.
Sir,
Oh,
after
good question.
remodeling an optimized supply chain route, should we use it in reverse supply chain, or we should create new route of the reverse supply chain?
Right. So after we model an optimized supply chain route, okay, good. Right. So I would like to break your question up into two parts, mainly because you know, it involves optimization, the normal supply chain in the forward sense, all right? And then there's also the reverse aspect as well. So there are actually two parts of the question. So some companies might have already, you know, done some kind of optimization in terms of the transportation, because you need to be very effective on, you know, like delivering the products to the customer. So they must have done that when they set up the company, all right? Let's just assume that that happens. But when it comes to the reverse part, the question is there a business case for optimizing the reverse route? The business case in the sense of whether is it economically viable to start, you know, optimizing the reverse route. But the reason is because it might be the case, is it me who is actually doing the collection, or should I be outsourcing it to somebody else, like a third party? Because if I actually do outsource this to the third party, then I can continue operating my forward supply chain, right? Ignoring the reverse part because somebody else is going to do that for me. But if my obligation includes collection, then yes, I need to, you know, be trying to optimize the reverse route as well. At some stage, I'm sure if the legislation starts to kick in, then we have to be doing the reverse supply chain optimization too, right? Because that's my responsibility. I'm not sure if I answer your question. Yeah. A new route, all right? So the implication is whether a new route would be a part of it. I think I don't think we have a clear answer. It might be we need it or we do not need a new route, all right? Because it depends on the concentration of consumer, how geographically dispersed they are. Yeah, but I can imagine the answers for for yes and a no in terms of creating a new route. Yeah. There's a number of factors involved. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Yep.
All right.
Great.
So I think it's best to carefully analyze the situations or the specifics before deciding whether to adapt to the existing route or perhaps designing a route once.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's a whole host of factors involved in the decision. If it's my obligation, yes, all right, I'll take it. But whether I need a new route or not is another, you know, concern altogether. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the questions, Mr. Ahmad Ardi.
Thanks for the question. Yes, indeed.
Are there any new questions? All right.
Don't be shy.
All right. Perhaps there's a little bit of discussions about uh, closed loops supply
Yep.
chain. I have an analogy at first about it's about a Frankenstein that you made something from a scrap, from a basic scrap, and then suddenly it turned out to be something, whether it's beautiful or whether it's an abomination.
Yes.
But I think there is a more good analogy it is a phoenix rising from the ashes, perhaps. There is a renewal and a regeneration, and there is a transformations, there's a sustainability and resilience, and also a cyclical, because the phoenix rising is about symbolizes rebirth and renewal by rising from its own ashes, and a closed loop supply chains also emphasizes the regenerations of materials and products. Instead of being discarded as a waste, I think it changes its appearance into more fashionable or a unique design, thus extending their life cycle and minimizing environmental impact. I think,
That's true.
what about it? Do you have any different analogy or something related?
Well, I guess, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, my analogy would be more thinking about how we could be more careful about, how we become so focused on one thing that we have actually ignored opportunities from the other side of the coin. Because on the one side of the coin, it's saying that, well, you have to be doing something sets out through by a target. But then on the other hand, it's a bit like carrot and stick, right? There's a stick. If you don't meet the target, then you're going to pay a very, very heavy penalty, which is much heavier per pound with transportation, with collection and recycling combined, right? So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is slightly more encouraging in the sense of the carrot, that you need to have the carrot to bite. And I hope it's a sweet one that you are motivated to do so, because you have the incentive to actually reduce your reliance on supplier, especially in a very fragmented world. It's like deglobalization. We're trying to undo all the good work we have done for the past 50 years, and therefore it might be actually a very good carrot to buy after all. So I would think the analogy is more like a carrot and stick approach. And if I want to be idealistic about how we go about this carrot and stick approach, I think it's actually a combination of both, like perhaps to some extent, I think there should be a target, but a softer target. But on the other hand, the government must put in some sort of subsidy to actually encourage them to bite the carrot at the same time. So, it's like it's a bit of a combination of, two sides of the coin, if you like. So that's probably my analogy. So I think a student have a question. Could you explain any existing regulation policy on closed loop supply chain in Singapore compared to Indonesia? So regulation number 97 2017 is a roadmap towards 2025 clean from waste Indonesia, right? So there's this 2025 view, right, vision. It sets target of 30% waste reduction, okay, and 70% waste handling by 2025, okay, right. So when it comes to the one thing about Singapore government, right, to be fair, to be honest with you, I've not come across this particular regulation. I mean, I don't know every regulation in every part of the world, but my understanding is that my guess and my understanding is that Singapore government is extremely protective of businesses, and they are prepared to give leeway to some extent. Again, I'm sure there are regulations. I'm sure I'm very keen up, and perhaps in some way influencing policymakers around the world as well. But who is learning from who? On one hand, I'm not very sure, but my understanding is that they are prepared to give leeway in terms of meeting target requirement. But one thing, again, looking at Singapore manufacturing landscape itself, right? Understand is that it's definitely not as vibrant as Indonesia. Can imagine, like, we have a very small real estate space for manufacturing, and I think we're more acting like a control power in that sense. So the carbon footprint, if you like, area by area, comparing between Singapore and Indonesia, it will be a very different. Okay, I'm talking about manufacturing footprint per area. So I think I don't have a very clear answer to that, like the view about existing regulation policy, but from governments, how they work with businesses. I recall one parliamentary debate last year that the government is not in favor of creating anxiety among manufacturers by setting a target. All right. So our government has this opposition party trying to come in and say that I think they think the Singapore government should be providing what do you call, like should regulate the carbon prices just like the stock market. And then the incumbent government is saying, no, we are not going to do that. The reason is because we're introducing too much anxiety. All right. How are the manufacturers going to know prices for carbon next year? How am I going to tell, the manufacturing association what carbon prices we are going to set for them next year? So if you ask me about what could the closed loop supply chain regulation policy looks like, it is something that is very stable. Carbon prices is going to be very stable and reviewed every 5 years. This is exactly the stance of the incumbent Singapore government. All right. So I hope that the position is still the same. All right. They maintain that position that they want some sort of regular review on an extended basis. All right. So that is my understanding.
All right. Thank you for the questions as well. Perhaps one more questions before we go to the closing sections. Okay. All right. Well, I think there it is. In conclusion, I think the focus on sustainability and waste management in the industry significantly impacts the relevance of exploring logistics and reverse chain concepts in the context of producer responsibility. And as society increasingly prioritize environmental concerns, manufacturers also are under pressure to adopt more responsible practices, including the management of used good through the recycling programs. And without realizing it, we have reached the end of the time. Thank you for these valuable sessions. It is extraordinary that we have the opportunity to gain the knowledge from a professional like Dr. Yo. And to ladies and gentlemen, my fellow students, thank you for taking part in the International Experience Bold Series BINUS Online Discussions. Thank you once again for being a part of this webinar.